Good evening. We continue to follow breaking developments in the ongoing political crisis. Tonight, multiple regions are reporting unrest, and the government has not spoken publicly in more than 6 hours. Crowds have gathered in the capital and in several provincial cities. Security checkpoints are being set up on major roads at the same time.
The first province fell on a Tuesday morning when the governor of Iran, the agricultural heartland of the Republic of Persana, appeared on local television to announce that his regional government no longer recognized the authority of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Mohsen Rashidi. He stood before cameras in his modest office, flanked by military commanders who had defected to the opposition, and read a statement that would be replayed on screens around the world for days to come. The regime in the capital has lost its legitimacy, Governor Ahmad Nazemi declared, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was doing. It has massacred its own people. It has stolen the wealth of our nation. It has lied to us for 43 years. Today, the people of Khorasan declare that we will no longer submit to tyranny. We stand with the revolution. We stand for freedom. Within hours, 3 more provinces had issued similar declarations. By nightfall, the number had risen to 7. By the end of the week, 18 of Persana's 31 provinces had broken from the central government, their governors and military commanders joining a rebellion that had transformed from scattered protests into an existential threat to the regime that had ruled the nation for more than 4 decades. Supreme Leader Rashidi had not been seen in public for 11 days. The collapse had been building for months, though few outside the intelligence community had recognized the signs. The protest that erupted after the death of a young woman in morality police custody had never fully subsided, despite the regime's brutal attempts at suppression. Each crackdown had generated more martyrs, more outrage, more determination among a population that had finally lost its fear. The economy, strangled by international sanctions and decades of mismanagement, had reached a breaking point where even regime loyalists could no longer feed their families. And the security forces, once the reliable enforcers of state terror, had begun to fracture as soldiers refused orders to fire on their own people. The Revolutionary Guard, the elite military force that served as the regime's Praetorian Guard, remained largely loyal. But even their 190 Iyo al-Iron members could not hold a nation of 88 million people who had decided, collectively and irrevocably, that they would rather die than continue living under oppression. Commander Darius Mohammadi stood on the rooftop of the provincial government building in Shirazan, watching smoke rise from a dozen points across the city below. He was 47 years old, a career military officer who had served the regime faithfully for 25 years, rising through the ranks to command the garrison that was responsible for security in the nation's 3rd largest city. He had enforced curfews, suppressed protests, arrested dissidents, done all the things that the regime required of its loyal servants. 3 weeks ago, his daughter had been shot during a peaceful demonstration. She was 19 years old, a university student studying engineering, a gentle soul who had never raised her hand against anyone. She had gone to the protest with friends, believing that her generation could achieve through peaceful means what their parents had been too afraid to attempt. She had been carrying a sign that read "Woman, Life, Freedom," when a sniper's bullet entered her chest and ended her life. Darius had held her in his arms as she died, her blood soaking his uniform, her last words a whispered apology for disappointing him. He had returned to his command post that night and continued performing his duties because he did not know what else to do. He had attended his daughter's funeral and accepted condolences from colleagues who privately wondered if he would break. He had listened to the Supreme Leader's speech praising the security forces for their heroism in defending the nation against foreign-backed terrorists. And something inside him had snapped. "Commander." His aide approached cautiously, sensing the dangerous energy that radiated from his superior. "The provincial governor is asking for your decision. He needs to know if the garrison will support the Declaration of Independence." Darius looked out at the city, at the fires and the crowds and the chaos that had become the new normal. He thought about his daughter, about her dreams and her courage, about the look in her eyes as she died. He thought about all the orders he had followed over the years, all the people he had helped imprison and torture and kill, all the compromises he had made in service to a regime that murdered children for carrying signs. "Tell the governor," he said quietly, "that the Shirazan garrison stands with the people. Tell him that Commander Mohammadi is prepared to defend this province against any force the regime sends to reclaim it. And tell him that I will personally execute any soldier under my command who fires on unarmed civilians." The aide saluted and hurried away to deliver the message. Darius remained on the rooftop, watching the sunset over a city that was tearing itself apart, wondering if he was a hero or a traitor, and suspecting that the answer depended entirely on who won the war that was just beginning. In the capital city of Teherani, the seat of power that had controlled Persana for more than 4 decades, the mood had shifted from confident repression to barely concealed panic. The ministries and military headquarters that lined the grand boulevards were operating around the clock, their lights burning through the night as officials struggled to respond to a crisis that seemed to grow worse by the hour. The Supreme Leader's compound had become a fortress, surrounded by multiple rings of Revolutionary Guard units, its airspace monitored by anti-aircraft batteries, its communications secured by the most sophisticated encryption available. Ayatollah Mohsen Rashidi had not left the compound in 11 days, not since a rocket attack by unknown assailants had struck the outer perimeter and convinced his security advisors that his safety could no longer be guaranteed anywhere else. At 84 years old, Rashidi had ruled Persana for 27 years, inheriting the position from his predecessor and maintaining power through a combination of religious authority, political cunning, and ruthless suppression of any challenge to his control. He had survived assassination attempts, coup plots, and periodic uprisings that had threatened to topple the regime. Each time he had emerged stronger, his enemies dead or imprisoned, his grip on power seemingly unshakable. This time was different. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his advisors avoided his eyes, in the reports that arrived hourly documenting the disintegration of his authority across the nation. 18 provinces had declared independence. The military was fragmenting, with entire units defecting to the opposition. The economy had essentially ceased to function, with banks closed, supply chains broken, and inflation rendering the currency nearly worthless. And the international community, which had always eventually accommodated the regime despite periodic condemnations, was now openly supporting the revolution, providing intelligence and material support to forces seeking to overthrow him. He was losing. For the first time in his long reign, he was genuinely losing, and he did not know how to stop it. "Bring me General Taheri," he commanded, his voice still carrying the authority that decades of absolute power had instilled. General Hassan Taheri was the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, the most powerful military figure in the nation after the Supreme Leader himself. He was a hard man, a true believer who had built his career on absolute loyalty to the regime, who had personally overseen some of the most brutal operations against dissidents and protesters. If anyone could save the regime, it was Taheri. The general arrived within minutes, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos engulfing the nation, his face betraying nothing of whatever thoughts or doubts he might harbor. "Supreme Leader, how may I serve?" Rashidi studied him carefully, searching for any sign of wavering loyalty. "The situation is deteriorating. I need to know what can be done to restore order." Taheri's expression remained impassive. "Supreme Leader, I must be honest with you. The situation is worse than the reports suggest. We have lost effective control of more than half the country. The regular army is disintegrating, with desertions running at more than 1,000 per day. Our supply lines are compromised, our communications are being intercepted, and our intelligence networks have been penetrated. The Revolutionary Guard remains loyal? The Guard remains loyal. But we are 190,000 men trying to control a nation of 88 million. We can hold the capital. We can hold some of the major cities. But we cannot hold everywhere, and the more forces we concentrate in one area, the more we lose in others." Rashidi felt a cold weight settling in his chest. "What are you telling me, General?" "I am telling you, Supreme Leader, that we cannot win a conventional military campaign against the entire population. Our only options are negotiation or escalation." "Negotiation with whom? The traitors who have declared independence? The terrorists who attack our forces? The foreign powers who fund and arm our enemies?" "Escalation, then." Taheri's voice dropped slightly. "We have capabilities that have not been deployed, weapons that could turn the tide, but their use would have consequences that cannot be undone." Rashidi understood what the general was suggesting. The regime possessed chemical weapons, stockpiles that had been accumulated over decades and never acknowledged publicly. Their use against the population would be a war crime of historic proportions, an atrocity that would make the regime an international pariah and potentially invite foreign military intervention. But it would also terrorize the population into submission, demonstrating that the regime was willing to do anything, absolutely anything, to maintain power. It was the logic of the cornered animal, the calculation of men who had nothing left to lose. Not yet, Rashidi decided, but prepare the capability. If the situation continues to deteriorate, we may have no other choice. Taheri saluted and departed, leaving the Supreme Leader alone in his bunker, surrounded by the trappings of power that suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. He had spent his entire adult life building this regime, sacrificing everything for the revolutionary ideals that had once inspired him. Now he sat in an underground room, hiding from his own people, contemplating the use of weapons that would kill thousands of innocents. How had it come to this? He thought about the young woman whose death had sparked the current uprising, about her crime of allowing a strand of hair to escape from her headscarf, about the morality police who had beaten her so severely that she died in custody. He thought about all the young people who had been killed since then, about the parents who had buried children, about the waves of grief and rage that had swept through the nation. He thought about his own children and grandchildren, about the privileged lives they had lived while ordinary Persanians struggled under sanctions and mismanagement. He thought about the corruption that had rotted the regime from within, about the billions stolen by officials who preached revolutionary purity while enriching themselves. He thought about the choices he had made, the paths he had taken, the person he had become. And for a moment, just a moment, he wondered if the protesters were right, if the regime had lost its way, if the ideals that had once animated the revolution had been betrayed by the very people who claimed to uphold them. The moment passed. He was 84 years old, and he had not survived this long by entertaining doubts. The regime would prevail because it had to prevail, because the alternative was unthinkable, because he could not accept that everything he had built and sacrificed for would be swept away by children with signs and slogans. He would fight. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he would fight. The world was watching as Persana tore itself apart. In capitals across the globe, leaders and diplomats and intelligence analysts gathered around screens showing footage from a nation in revolutionary upheaval. The images were extraordinary. Crowds of millions filling the streets of major cities, security forces openly defecting to join the protesters, provincial governments declaring independence in a cascade that seemed to accelerate by the day. President Sarah Mitchell convened her national security team in the Situation Room. The screens on the walls showing real-time feeds from multiple Persanian cities, alongside maps tracking the shifting lines of control. "Give me the current assessment," she ordered. Director of National Intelligence Robert Chen pulled up a map that had been updated just hours ago. "Madam President, the regime has effectively lost control of 18 provinces, representing approximately 60% of the nation's territory and 55% of its population. The remaining provinces are contested, with varying degrees of regime authority. Only the capital and its immediate surroundings remain firmly under government control. What about the Revolutionary Guard? Still largely loyal, but increasingly isolated. They're concentrated in and around the capital, protecting key regime facilities and leadership. Their ability to project power beyond that perimeter is severely limited." Secretary of State James Morrison spoke up. "Our diplomatic sources are reporting that Supreme Leader Rashidi has not been seen in public for nearly 2 weeks. There's speculation that he's either incapacitated or hiding. The regime's public communications have been handled entirely by subordinates. Any indication of succession planning? Power struggles within the leadership? Nothing concrete, but there are signs of tension between different factions. The Revolutionary Guard leadership appears to favor a hardline response, while some civilian officials are reportedly exploring the possibility of negotiations with opposition figures." President Mitchell studied the map, her mind working through the implications. Persana had been a thorn in American foreign policy for decades. Its nuclear program, its support for terrorist proxies, its confrontational stance toward regional allies. The possibility of regime change had been discussed in theoretical terms for years, but no one had seriously expected it to happen so quickly. "What are our options?" she asked. National Security Advisor Patricia Holmes stepped forward. "We have 3 basic choices, Madam President. First, we can maintain our current posture. Diplomatic support for the protesters, continued sanctions against the regime, intelligence sharing with opposition forces. This carries minimal risk but also provides minimal influence over the outcome. Second, we can increase our support for the opposition, potentially including military equipment, training, and direct assistance to provincial forces that have declared independence. This would accelerate the regime's collapse, but would also draw us deeper into what could become a protracted civil war. Third, we can pursue a diplomatic solution, using our contacts with both sides to broker some kind of negotiated transition. This would minimize bloodshed, but would also likely result in elements of the current regime retaining power, which many Persanians would find unacceptable." Mitchell considered the options. None of them were ideal. All of them carried significant risks and uncertain outcomes. But doing nothing was also a choice, one that would leave the fate of 88 million people entirely to chance. What's the humanitarian situation? Holmes's expression darkened. Deteriorating rapidly. Supply chains have broken down across most of the country. Food and medicine are running short in many areas. Refugees are fleeing conflict zones, creating pressure on neighboring countries. And there are reports, unconfirmed but credible, that the regime is preparing to use chemical weapons against civilian populations if the situation continues to deteriorate. Chemical weapons? Yes. Madam President, our intelligence suggests that the Revolutionary Guard has been moving stockpiles to forward positions and briefing commanders on deployment protocols. We don't believe they've made the decision to use them yet, but the capability is being prepared. Mitchell felt a chill run down her spine. The use of chemical weapons against civilians would be an atrocity of historic proportions, a war crime that would demand response. But any military intervention to prevent such use would be enormously complex and risky, potentially drawing the United States into a conflict that could spiral in unpredictable directions. I want options for preventing chemical weapons use, targeted strikes against stockpiles, cyber operations against command and control. Whatever we can do to take that option off the table without triggering a wider war. Yes, Madam President. And I want a channel open to responsible elements within the regime. Not Rashidi, he's not going to negotiate. But there must be people in that government who can see where this is heading, who would rather negotiate a transition than go down with the ship. Find them. Talk to them. See if there's a path to ending this without more bloodshed. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering military positioning, diplomatic outreach, humanitarian response, and a dozen other aspects of a crisis that seemed to grow more complex by the hour. By the end, Mitchell had approved a comprehensive strategy that would increase support for the opposition while simultaneously pursuing diplomatic channels that might lead to a negotiated solution. It was the best she could do given the constraints she faced. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The provincial capital of Shirazan became the de facto headquarters of the revolution, a city of 3 million people that had declared independence early and had successfully defended itself against multiple attempts by regime forces to reassert control. Commander Darius Mohammadi had become a national figure in the weeks since his defection, his story of personal tragedy and moral awakening resonating with millions who had experienced similar journeys from compliance to resistance. He had been interviewed by international media, his face broadcast around the world, his words inspiring others to follow his example. But fame was a burden he had never sought and did not want. What he wanted was justice for his daughter and for all the other victims of the regime's violence. What he wanted was a future for Persana that did not require families to bury their children. What he wanted was peace. The Revolutionary Council, as the opposition leadership had styled itself, met in a government building that had been hastily converted into a military headquarters. Representatives from the 18 independent provinces gathered around a large table, their faces showing the strain of weeks of conflict and the weight of decisions that would shape their nation's future. The regime is massing forces for a major offensive, reported General Farid Ahmadi, a former regular army commander who had defected with his entire division. Our intelligence suggests they're planning to retake the western provinces first, then push toward Shirazan. They're mobilizing everything they have left, including Revolutionary Guard units that were previously protecting the capital. What are our defensive capabilities? Asked Governor Nazemi, who had become the unofficial political leader of the revolution. We have approximately 120. 0 men under arms across all provinces, though training and equipment vary widely. We have the advantage of interior lines and popular support, but the Revolutionary Guard has heavier weapons and more experienced commanders. A direct confrontation would be costly for both sides. Commander Mohammadi spoke up. What about the international community? We've been promised support. Where is it? Arriving slowly, Governor Nazemi admitted. The Western powers are providing intelligence and some equipment, but they're reluctant to commit more directly. They're afraid of escalation, of being drawn into a conflict they can't control. So we're on our own. For now, yes. But our position is stronger than it might appear. The regime cannot sustain an extended campaign. Their economy is collapsing, their international isolation is complete, and every day brings more defections from their ranks. Time is on our side if we can survive the immediate threat. The discussion continued, covering military deployments, supply logistics, diplomatic initiatives, and the 1,000 details that determined whether revolution succeeded or failed. Mohammadi listened carefully, but found his mind wandering to thoughts of his daughter, of the future she had been fighting for, of whether her sacrifice would ultimately mean anything. After the meeting, he walked out onto the balcony overlooking the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the same sky his daughter had loved to photograph. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sounds of celebration, music and chanting from crowds that still gathered every evening to express their support for the revolution. A voice spoke behind him. "You look troubled, Commander." He turned to find Mariam Hosseini, a young woman who had become famous for her video documentation of regime atrocities. She had been in Shirajan for a week, recording the revolution's progress, conducting interviews that were broadcast to audiences around the world. "I was thinking about my daughters," he admitted, "about whether she would be proud of what we're doing here. From everything I've heard about her, I think she would be. I hope so." He looked back at the sunset. She believed in peaceful change. She thought we could achieve freedom without violence, without war. She was wrong about that, I think. But she wasn't wrong about what we're fighting for. No, she wasn't. They stood in silence for a moment. Two people from different generations united by their commitment to a cause that demanded everything they had. "Can I ask you something?" Mariam said. "Of course. Do you think we're going to win?" Mohammadi considered the question carefully. "I think we've already won in a sense. We've proven that the regime is not invincible, that its power depends on our fear, that when we stop being afraid, they have nothing. Whatever happens next, that knowledge can never be taken away. But militarily, politically, will we actually succeed in creating a new persona? I don't know. The regime is still dangerous. They still have weapons and soldiers and the willingness to use them. We could lose. Many of us could die. But even if we lose this battle, the war will continue. The desire for freedom, once awakened, cannot be extinguished. If not us, then those who come after us. If not now, then later. Eventually, freedom wins. It always does." Mariam nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "That's what I'll tell people. That's the story I'll share." "Good. That's the story that matters." The sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the darkness, armies were preparing for battle. Somewhere in the capital, a dying regime was contemplating atrocities that would shock the world. Somewhere across the nation, millions of people were living through the most tumultuous period in their history, not knowing whether they would see freedom in their lifetimes or perish in the struggle to achieve it. But in that moment, on that balcony, two people allowed themselves to feel something that had been in short supply for far too long: hope. The regime's offensive began 3 days later, a coordinated assault that threw everything the Revolutionary Guard had left against the western provinces that had been the first to declare independence. Columns of tanks and armored vehicles rolled across the desert, supported by helicopter gunships and artillery batteries that pounded defensive positions with devastating accuracy. The provincial forces fought with desperate courage, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. Town after town fell to the advancing Guard units, their populations fleeing ahead of the onslaught, roads clogged with refugees carrying whatever they could salvage from their homes. Reports of atrocities began to filter out. Summary executions of suspected rebels, mass arrests of fighting-age men, the systematic destruction of infrastructure that had supported the revolution. Commander Mohammadi coordinated the defense from his headquarters in Shirajan, deploying his forces to slow the advance while preparing fallback positions for the inevitable retreat. He knew that he could not stop the offensive, that the Revolutionary Guard's advantages in firepower and training were simply too great to overcome in a conventional battle. But he could make them pay for every mile they advanced, could bleed them until they no longer had the strength to continue, could buy time for the international community to respond. The response, when it came, was more decisive than anyone had expected. President Mitchell had been monitoring the offensive with growing alarm, watching as the regime's forces carved through opposition territory, as reports of atrocities accumulated, as the humanitarian situation deteriorated toward catastrophe. When intelligence confirmed that chemical weapons had been moved to forward positions and that orders for their use were imminent, she made her decision. "Launch the strikes," she ordered. The operation, codenamed Crimson Shield, was executed with devastating precision. Cruise missiles launched from ships in the Southern Sea struck chemical weapons storage facilities, command and control centers, and Revolutionary Guard headquarters across the country. Cyber operations disabled communications networks and air defense systems. Special operations forces conducted targeted raids against key leadership figures. The Supreme Leader's compound was not directly targeted, but the missiles that struck facilities around it sent an unmistakable message. The regime's atrocities would not go unanswered. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. The Revolutionary Guard offensive, already stretched thin by the distances involved and the resistance it was encountering, suddenly found itself fighting blind. Communication with higher headquarters was severed. Supply lines were disrupted. The air support that had been devastating opposition positions disappeared as pilots were grounded by damaged airfields and destroyed radar systems. Within 48 hours, the offensive had stalled. Within a week, it had begun to collapse. Guard units retreating toward the capital as provincial forces regrouped and counterattacked. And in his underground bunker, Supreme Leader Rashidi finally understood that he had lost. The end came not with a dramatic final battle, but with a quiet surrender, negotiated over secure communications between regime officials and representatives of the Revolutionary Council. General Taheri, recognizing that further resistance would only lead to more bloodshed without changing the ultimate outcome, had taken control of what remained of the government and opened channels to the opposition. The terms were surprisingly moderate, given the regime's crimes. Senior leadership would be allowed to leave the country, their fate to be determined by international tribunals rather than revolutionary justice. Lower-ranking officials and military personnel who had not committed atrocities would be offered amnesty in exchange for cooperation with the transition. The Revolutionary Guard would be dissolved, its members given the choice of integration into a new national military or civilian resettlement. Supreme Leader Rashidi refused the offer of exile. When Revolutionary Council forces entered his compound, they found him in his private quarters, dead from a self-administered poison. He had left no note, no final message, no explanation for the choices that had led to this end. He died as he had lived, alone with his certainties, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the possibility that he had been wrong. The news of his death spread across Persana within hours, greeted with celebrations that erupted spontaneously in cities and towns throughout the nation. Crowds that had been suppressed for decades poured into the streets, their joy mixed with grief for all who had been lost, their hope for the future tempered by awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. Commander Darius Mohammadi was in Liberation Square in the capital when the announcement came, standing in the same plaza where his daughter had been killed, surrounded by millions of his countrymen who had gathered to witness the dawn of a new era. He did not celebrate. He simply stood silent, tears streaming down his face, thinking about everything that had been sacrificed to reach this moment. Mariam Hosseini found him there, her camera finally lowered, her role as documenter temporarily suspended. "It's over," she said. "No," he replied softly. "It's just beginning. The hard part comes now. Building something that's worth all the lives that were lost, that's the work that remains. Do you think we can do it?" He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had lived through decades of oppression and had finally found the courage to demand something better. He saw young and old, men and women, people from every province and background united by their shared experience and their shared hope. "I think we have to try, Knesset. For everyone who died believing that we could. For my daughter. For all the daughters and sons who deserve better than what we gave them." He paused, watching as the sun rose over a nation that was finally, after so many years of darkness, beginning to see the light. "Yes," he said finally. "I think we can do it. I think we must." The first free elections in Persana's history were held 6 months after the fall of the regime, a national exercise in democracy that drew participation from more than 80% of eligible voters. The Revolutionary Council had governed during the transition period, overseeing the drafting of a new constitution, the establishment of independent institutions, and the beginning of a truth and reconciliation process that would take years to complete. Governor Nazemi was elected as the first president of the new republic, his steady leadership during the revolution having earned him the trust of a nation that was cautious about placing too much power in any single individual. Commander Mohammadi declined offers of political office, choosing instead to lead the reform of the military into a professional force that would serve the people rather than oppress them. Mariam Hosseini continued her work as a journalist, documenting the challenges and triumphs of a nation learning to govern itself. Her footage from the revolution had been collected into a documentary that was shown in theaters around the world, a testament to the courage of ordinary people who had dared to demand their freedom. The new Persana was not perfect. No nation emerging from decades of authoritarian rule could be. There were tensions between different factions, disagreements about the pace and direction of reform, moments when it seemed that the fragile consensus might fracture. Old habits of thought and behavior did not disappear overnight, and the scars left by years of repression would take generations to fully heal. But there was also hope, real hope, grounded not in naive optimism, but in the demonstrated capacity of the Persanian people to come together, to sacrifice for each other, to build something better than what had come before. The streets that had run with blood now hosted festivals and markets and the ordinary bustle of civilian life. The prisons that had held political prisoners now stood empty, their doors opened, their records preserved as evidence of crimes that would never be forgotten. On the first anniversary of Liberation Day, a memorial was dedicated in the capital, honoring all who had died in the struggle for freedom. The names were carved into walls of white marble, thousands of them, each one representing a life cut short, a story ended too soon, a sacrifice that had helped purchase the freedom that the living now enjoyed. Commander Mohammadi stood before the wall, finding his daughter's name among the others. He touched the carved letters gently, remembering her face, her voice, her dreams that had been so violently extinguished. "We did it," he whispered. "Not the way you wanted, not without violence, but we did it. Persana is free. Your children, if you had lived to have them, will grow up in a country where they can speak their minds, where they can challenge their government, where they won't be killed for showing their hair or carrying a sign." He paused, feeling the weight of grief that would never fully lift. "I hope you can forgive me for the years I spent serving the regime, for not acting sooner, for not protecting you when you needed it most. I hope that what we've built here is worthy of your sacrifice. I hope that somewhere, somehow, you know that your death meant something." He stepped back from the wall, rejoining the crowds that had gathered for the anniversary ceremony. President Nazemi was speaking, his words carried by loudspeakers across the square, a message of hope and determination and gratitude for all who had brought them to this moment. The sun was setting over Persana, painting the sky in the same colors that Mohammadi's daughter had loved to photograph. A new day was ending, but another would dawn tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days to come, stretching into a future that was finally, after so many years of darkness, filled with possibility. The revolution was over. The work of building a nation had begun, and in Liberation Square, surrounded by the names of the fallen, the living gathered to honor the past and embrace the future. It was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow, against all odds, it was.